So let's continue to look at what's going on with the evolution of the members of the plant kingdom here. And remember, we've gone through these first two stages of adaptations from the algae into the bryophytes, these short plants, and then they evolved vascular tissue, and they started to get taller and taller. They had lignin, allowing them to get even taller and taller. And then the plants that were out there adapted because now the environment changed. And when the gymnosperms adapted, the environment actually changed pretty significantly. It turned much, much drier and colder. And you think about that, the driest place in your house is actually in your freezer, which is kind of weird because you see all the ice that's in there. But remember, ice is frozen water, and that makes your freezer a really dry environment because there isn't any liquid water available. And if you are an organism, remember, you need to have water for your cytoplasm. And if you're a plant, you need to have that liquid water available in order to do the process of photosynthesis. So how did these organisms adapt to that kind of environment? Well, one of the major adaptations that we see when we look at our gymnosperms is this development of the seed. And effectively what you're doing when you look at this is the seeds are protecting that gametophyte generation. So remember, when we looked at our last major evolution there with our fern example, the diploid sporophyte is what's growing out and making what we would consider the adult organism. And then there is the separate gametophyte. Well, this gametophyte is going to run into some problems because it's basically a separate small thing that is making the gametes, and the adult is no longer able to protect it. So what's the next step in this evolution is for the adult to basically surround its tissue that is making the gamete. So there you can see your adult with your diploid cells is surrounding the gametophyte generation of this. And now you're going to protect those cells that are your gametes in the or that are going to be used to produce your next generation for this organism right here. And so if we think about this process, what is the equivalent kind of structure that we can go out and look in plants that are out there? And you can go out to a conifer, think a pine tree that is out there. What you are looking at is the mature tree that came from those diploid tissues that were produced in that zygote when you had fertilization. And when this tree grows up, now they've got specific locations where the gametes are being produced, and they are protecting their young effectively here. The cones that we see on a tree with, like, think pine cones, inside of each of those individual little scales right there is where you're going to find your egg cells or your ovules. And inside of these little things that you see where they're shooting all that yellow stuff all over your car and it gets covered in pollen, those are the male cones that are right there. And so effectively when your car is getting coated in this pollen, think of it as your car is covered in the plant equivalent of sperm. So that tree has done a job on your car and covered it with sperm right there. Within the individual scales is where you find that egg cell, and it's protected inside of here. And the pollen gets blown off of the branches here, and it floats around, and then it ends up landing on that female cone, and some of it happens to hit this little portion of that scale right there, and then that's going to cause this to release its nuclei, and then those haploid nuclei are actually able to travel up here and get inside of here where you have the equivalent of the egg cell. And then you get your fertilization, you get your diploid cells that are produced inside of this protective scale, and this tree drops the pine cone, and it's got effectively hundreds of diploid babies inside of there, which are your seeds, and these are going to be protected. They're going to be dormant for a while until they germinate, and they're going to germinate when there is water available, and that's going to allow these pine trees to be more successful. So there is your diploid that grew from your cells that grew from two individual haploid cells that are out there. Now, we can see this process worked pretty well. I mean, think about how much of the planet is covered with pine trees out there. This was a very successful adaptation for these kinds of organisms, but it wasn't the end of the evolution of the members of the plant kingdom. They took their existing leaves and remodeled those structures, and they also took that process of, I was making these spores as pollen grains, and they started to remodel that. So when you look at this process of evolution with your fourth stage, your gymnosperms are remodeling their leaves and their seeds, and they're going to produce the equivalent, which is flowers and fruit. And this took place about, we'll say, 200 million years ago based on the fossil evidence that is out there. So somewhere within this range, again, you're looking at 100 million years of evolutionary processes taking place, or even longer than that when we separate this origin of the seeds to the origin of plants with flowers that are known as angiosperms. And this is the majority of plants that we see today, and there are more than 250,000 different species of angiosperms compared to less than 1,000 conifers. So these guys not only got a really good adaptation, but it allowed them to develop all these different kinds of species that are out there over the last 200 million years. And if we look this process on, okay, how could you modify a leaf? Well, you take this existing green structure and you change some things within it. And one modified leaf that we can see in these angiosperms is the flower that produces it, or that is produced here. And here you can see the petal. These are basically leaves that had a mutation that gave them a little bit of color, and maybe they started to change in shape that are out there. So these are the thinner and softer leaves that are produced at the end of a branch or within a branch to make these flowers and attract the pollinators. Another modified leaf that we can see is these little green leaves that are actually going to be surrounding this flower in the bud stage. And you can see this in spring. Just go out and look on the branches of your trees that are out there, and they have that little bud growing with the leaves inside of it, and then this green sepal around the outside, that protective layer right there. And if we look on some plants that are out there, this is what's known as a perfect plant, because it's actually got these male and female reproductive organs on the same kind of structure right here. The female gametophyte generation has been remodeled into what's known as the carpel right here. So this is kind of like what we saw in the scale with your egg cell or the ovule in the surrounding region within the ovary, and then it grows up to make this little stigma where your pollen can land, and then the pollen tube grows down this style to get access to the ovary right there. When we look over here on the male gametophyte that you find in your angiosperms, they've got what's known as a stamen. So you can remember the male part because men. And on this is this filament that grows out, again, a modified structure right there. And at the very end of this is where you find what's known as the anther. And this is the part of the plant that produces pollen grains. So again, those male gametophyte cells that are produced by meiosis rather than mitosis there. And if we look at this process again, those tissues, the anther and the ovary, are the ones that are actually producing your haploid cells. So there you can see your anther cells on the ends of this are actually going to go through that process of meiosis to make your haploid cells. And the same thing is going on over here within that ovary. You make this ovule cell that's going to divide via meiosis, and also, interestingly, in plants, they do mitosis. So they actually make some copies of that original haploid cell, and then it's going to spread out, and you're going to have your diploid sporophyte generation that grows up once that egg is fertilized right there. And if we look a little bit closer at this process, it's known as double fertilization. It's kind of interesting. The pollen is going to float around and it lands on that flower out there, and this pollen tube grows down inside of here. So it's really interesting. The pollen brings two nuclei inside of the embryo sac there, and they literally do make a tube that grows all the way down inside of here, and it gives them access to that little egg cell right there. And the two nuclei that travel down there are actually going to form different kinds of tissues inside of the structure in the plant. The diploid zygote, that's going to form the embryo right there. And then you see this other interesting thing. The other nucleus is going to fuse with a diploid nucleus inside of this little seed right here, and that is going to give you a triploid part of this. And so this is what's known as the endosperm layer right there. And this is how we get so many weird chromosomal abnormalities when you look at plants that are out there. They can become polyploidy because they're doing this interesting form of double fertilization right here. And when you look at this endosperm, it's surrounded by this seed coat layer that is that protective layer to protect your children, and inside of there, that endosperm is effectively food reserves for this baby little embryo right here. And if we look at and start to consider this process of, well, we've talked about these are both plants that make seeds. What's the difference? The gymnosperm is making what are known as naked seeds. The angiosperms over here, those flowering plants, are making their seeds, but then consider this protective coating around the outside. That's the equivalent of the scale over here. But these guys, that ovary that surrounded that little egg cell, that is what's actually growing up to produce the fruit. And when we look at this, it's kind of an interesting thing. There are certain plants that we consider vegetables. They are technically fruit because they do contain some seeds that have this thick ovary around the outside. So think about eggplants or zucchini. They have this fruit around the outside there. Some examples of dry fruit would be things like rice or wheat or nuts. They do have this outer protective layer around the outside that did develop from the ovary. We look at and think about, okay, why did these plants make pollen and make the fruit? Well, they were finding ways to protect their kids and to protect their gametes so that they could be traveling further. The gametes are no longer tied into water. They don't need those flagella because they can effectively float on the wind. So you can get dispersal of your pollen, and then that can also result in seeds being produced that can get transported. So think about an animal. This one has the seeds stuck on its fur. This one over here is eating those little babies and then digesting off that outer layer, and it's releasing the seeds. So that's going to increase the transport of these plants away from their parents. Another thing that we can look at in terms of these flowering plants is they are making more efficient vascular tissue to transport your fluids even further, and that's going to allow you to basically get more available water and sugar throughout your body. And if you think about the most successful thing for these kinds of angiosperms, if you've got flowers, you are attracting animals that have also developed during this stage of plant evolution, and they're coming over here and getting some sugar from the plant, and they are effectively carrying the sperm. Instead of the sperm blowing through the wind randomly, now your sperm are being targeted for other flowers that are out there that have those female eggs that are out there. So this process of not only protecting your sperm, but now you are shooting it specifically at its destination is a very efficient method of increasing your next generation possibilities that the gymnosperms don't necessarily have, that the angiosperms do. And if we look at this process of angiosperm evolution, you can see when we look at the clade right here that they have diversified a little bit into these different groups. There's our water lilies. There's an interesting thing with our avocados and cinnamons and our pepper plants that are out there. So think black pepper for your table. But the other thing that we see here is these two major groups of flowering plants that evolved. And you'll be looking at these more in lab, but you can see one group only forms one little seed inside of the or one little leaf in the embryo, and the other one makes two leaves. So these are known as cotyledons or seed leaves. And that divides us up into two groups of plants that have massive diversity within those groups.